Happy OONSDAY, everyone. For those of you who are new to my channel, this is about 33 raccoons on my patio. I'm finishing up a game that I played with them. I put together elaborate games for the animals and for the viewers to participate in. Now, all of last year and half of this year, I continued this project, but it got to be to the point where I got complaints from the neighbors, because I live in a suburban area, that they called the authorities on me, and the authorities came to my house and kindly informed me that if I continued, I'd receive a $50 to a $5,000 a day fine. So I ceased all activities and I'm in compliance with the law. But in the meanwhile, I've just been contemplating animal feeding, the pros and the cons, and if the positives outweigh the negatives. And I have my opinion, and I've heard a lot of your opinions too. We've done little surveys and questionnaires, and those of you who chime in are already animal feeders, so we're all a little biased with our points of view. But for those of you who are new to this channel, I'd really like your opinions on your thoughts with animal feeding, and we're going to go over some of the pros and cons today, and we're going to discuss 4 TV figures and scientific figures that whose names will sound familiar to some of you, and discuss their interactions with wildlife, because I think it raises an intriguing question as to who's allowed to interact and feed wildlife and who isn't, and why is that the case. Okay, let's dive right in with what some of the cons are according to wildlife experts on feeding wildlife. Now, you'll get different opinions from wildlife experts on feeding birds. That seems to be an exception. But for most mammals, they have a list of cons that they would list for all of us to take into consideration. Here's one of the first ones. Lack of proper nutrients from human food or pet food. A lot of you who saw me feed my raccoons saw me mostly use high-protein dog food and peanuts, which were a high source of protein too. And I also gave them nice treats. You'll see in this video I'm tossing them marshmallows, and I gave them some cookies and perhaps some Halloween treats in there. No chocolate. I would usually do research on which foods a raccoon can or cannot have, and I would steer away from things like chocolate, macadamia nuts, avocados, things that have been known to be harmful to them. But I can certainly understand that point of view with certain animals. If you're giving them, let's say I fed my raccoons nothing but cookies, that certainly might do them more harm than good in the long run. So another argument for not feeding wildlife would be their loss of natural fear of humans. I know when I had company over once, I was really surprised that my raccoons came up to company, I was present, and stood up on their legs and begged, and that did concern me. I had a sister-in-law who seemed very uncomfortable with it. I had an uncle who just loved it. But I can understand it being an issue for a complete stranger that doesn't understand why is a raccoon coming up to me. I could see them being terrified by that, actually. I haven't heard any stories at all from my neighbors of that ever occurring, and I think anyone who would stomp their feet, raise their hands up, and make a scene, that raccoon would take off right away. But there might be other animals in which that's not the case. I could picture it going really wrong with something like a bear. Another con would be humans can get exposed to diseases that wildlife carries, and also large congregations of animals spreads disease faster among that population. Now in my state here in Wisconsin, feeding deer is illegal because of something called chronic wasting disease. It's a brain disease. And when deer are all eating from the same feeder, it can be transmitted through that saliva. So you get deer licking on the same salt lick or eating from the same area of corn. That transmission of that disease happens quickly, and that could be with any animal, especially with raccoons. If there were rabies present, there is none present in my area, that if they all came together and it just takes one bad apple in the group, that rabies could start to spread really fast. So that is a reasonable con right there. Another argument made by experts for not feeding animals would be dependency on our food. Picture a young baby coming up to you and you consistently give it dog food or you consistently give it human food, and it's just never learns the skills on its own, how to hunt, how to forage, and live wildly, live naturally off the land. Another issue could be problems that neighbors have with property damage. If you have animals coming into an area that they shouldn't be, and let's say I went on vacation and they wanted food and they know a backyard and a house and a patio door equals food, or a human equals food, they might go to town on a screen window where they smell the goodies inside and tear right in. If you're feeding wildlife, let's say like large numbers of raccoons like I am, and you happen to live in a busy area, those raccoons are going to be traversing roads more than they normally would, which could increase road kills. So that is something to take into consideration as a con. Another argument is overpopulation of an animal. Certainly you could think of mice or rats that have easy access to grains on farms. That's why a lot of farmers have cats to kind of thin the population of mice, because the food is so easy and abundant. With some animals though, I don't know that humans really have the right to fuss about overpopulation. Have you ever heard the old coinage? It might even be from the Bible. Before you nitpick about the splinter in someone else's eye, deal with the log in your own eye. And, well, there's 8 billion of us on this planet, and if any species is overpopulated, it's us. So maybe we shouldn't be saying there's too many of that animal. Yeah. Now these are a list of cons that you'll find on most websites from wildlife officials, whether it's state or federal, especially national parks, pushing these cons. I can only speak from my personal experience. I've been feeding wildlife since I was 4 years old. So we're talking decades and decades. And I've never personally noticed any of this happening. All the animals I fed could also feed themselves just fine. It was always supplemental what I gave them. They didn't depend on me. They all seemed to go about reproducing and having babies. They'd bring their babies, and those babies would grow up and have their babies. So it didn't seem to me like the circle of life was being broken, that nature was crumbling down from my actions. I never heard of anything worse than a bird feeder being knocked over by a neighbor. I've never heard of anyone being injured, or a raccoon coming up and touching a person or being aggressive with a person. So my personal anecdotal story is this hasn't occurred, but it's not to say that it can't. And I'm lucky where I live that I'm on a cul-de-sac, so the issue with road kills isn't there. Behind the park next to me though is a freeway system, and I do worry about the raccoons crossing that and getting killed. And I do see dead raccoons all over my state all the time when I drive. Vehicles certainly have to be the leading cause of death for raccoons. Okay, what are some of the pros to feeding wildlife? For some animals that are lacking in food from our overdevelopment and loss of habitat, it supplements their diet when there's been such heavy development in an area that held a lot of animals, that you can get them through that period. Another thing it does is it promotes wildlife awareness. When you interact with an animal like this, you're more likely to support conservation efforts. And you're more likely to be a more altruistic and empathetic individual because you're invested in caring about a living thing. And probably more than anything else, it just provides joy and pleasure and gives meaning to life. So as I promised, we're going to discuss 4 different individuals that I think encapsulate a viewpoint that speaks to me on how they interacted with wildlife that I think will shed some light on this subject matter. And out of all of those, Steve Irwin, otherwise known as the Crocodile Hunter, a famous television character, speaks to me more than most of these others we're going to discuss today. And here's a quote from Steve Irwin. He said, "When people touch an animal, the animal touches their heart, and instantly we've won them over to the conservation of that species." That's something he strove to do in his family at his zoo, is to give people the opportunity to touch an animal. And for the common folk like us, just average Joes in our backyards, the best way to touch an animal is to feed an animal, because otherwise it really has no reason to come up to you. And I can speak personally, touching an animal is incredible. Touching these raccoons is magical, and they are the most friendly, well-behaved, polite animals, and most people would never know that unless they took the time to get to know them. And you get to know them with food. Just like a woman gets a man to marry him, like my wife did to me, it's through food. It is a magical substance. I used to just love watching Steve Irwin and his nature shows. The passion he brought to animals was immensely infectious. His childlike demeanor, his love, his giddiness over touching an animal after running after a lizard, picking it up, or a snake, the adrenaline coursing through him, and the way he spoke straight from the heart captured me unlike any other nature show I had seen before. I had seen David Attenborough and all the guys of old that spoke in the very monotone voice with long view camera lens shots of an animal. This made it so much more personal. And it got me to care about things like lizards and snakes and even spiders, things I never really cared about at all before. They just weren't things I thought about. Because he spoke from the heart and because he was so passionate, you couldn't help but to come away caring yourself. And he got people to change minds about things like rattlesnakes in North America, ranchers that would kill them with such ease. He stressed the importance of having these animals on the landscape, and he got us all to care. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of wildlife experts out there that are just absolute purists that would say what he did was actually harmful, that he was harassing animals, that he was increasing their stress levels by trying to be an entertainer. But I really think these individuals are letting perfect be the enemy of good. The good that came from Steve Irwin far outdoes that little moment of an animal being a little stressed out over being handled. He changed the world. So another impactful scientist that changed the world with her findings is Jane Goodall. We all know her for being an expert with chimpanzees. She spent years of her life with a group of chimps in Tanzania, and her research uncovered things about chimps we never knew. And she did things that were very controversial to these purist scientists. So what she did is she would name the chimps human names, anthropomorphizing them. She would give them human qualities to make them more relatable. She touched them. A lot of people don't know this. She put out feeding stations to get them to come closer so she could study them. That's right. Jane Goodall, the scientist, put food out for the animals. And this is the only way you really get accepted into a group, to really see their behavior and to understand them. It did lead to extra aggression from other groups that saw this easy food source and they wanted to compete for it. But again, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Look at all the good that's come from her research. She observed them using tools that completely changed how we thought about other animals. She observed that they ate meat, not just vegetables. All the things she did, her life's work caused a greater appreciation and a greater conservation for chimpanzees. That wouldn't have been the case hadn't she broken the rules. So another rule breaker, his name is John Hutto. I saw his special on PBS called Touching the Wild, where he spent, I think it was 7 years of his life living with a herd of mule deer in Wyoming. And in order to pull that off, dun da da da, he had to take food with him. He would have food in his pockets. He would put food out for the mule deer until they accepted him in the herd. And when they did, it was amazing. You would see him putting his hand on their neck, on their back, just hanging out with them like another deer. You know, I don't want to give too much away about it, but he got to know these animals very intimately, very close, like I did with my raccoons. And not far from where he was doing research, he heard a gunshot go off, and a hunter killed a deer he had known for multiple years, a big buck. And he actually went over and helped carry that buck to load it into the back of the truck. A friend. I made friends with these raccoons. If I ever found out someone shot my raccoon, ran it over with a car, trapped it and moved it, I would be absolutely devastated. I can't imagine what that was like for him. You know, looking into the subject matter, I uncovered that many National Geographic photographers and other wildlife photographers, in order to get that good shot, they've baited, they've put out food to bring that animal in close enough in a good camera range. And many times they even set up a scene. Sometimes they even borrow animals from zoos to get that shot they want. Now again, I don't criticize them for this. Their higher mission of raising awareness and promoting conservation seems to me to justify this activity just fine. For goodness sakes, most states allow baiting so that you can shoot an animal dead. I think it should be fine, this is my opinion, to put food out to shoot an animal with a camera. Okay, here's a personality some of you may know right away, and some of you probably have never heard of. His name is Timothy Treadwell. Who is Timothy Treadwell? Timothy Treadwell loved grizzly bears. He was an advocate for the grizzly bear up in Alaska. He spent 13 summers in the wilds of Alaska living with grizzly bears. I'm talking in a modest tent with modest supplies, and him and his camcorder, he would get right up with giant bears that can swipe your head right off. And he was passionate. He called himself a kind warrior. He's very controversial because of the ending. He ended up being killed by a bear, and he had his girlfriend with him, and she ended up being killed by a bear. And there's a documentary called Grizzly Man. It came out in 2005. I highly recommend you watch it. And I recently rewatched it, and I have to say it came off very differently to me from the first time I saw it. And I think because of what I've done with raccoons, I'm not comparing myself to him, but I have a lot more empathy for him. I remember in the documentary there's a lot of focus on him and his mental state, and I really think there should have been more focus on him and what he actually did and accomplished as an animal lover, as someone who cared deeply about grizzly bears. It's quite a feat for anyone to get that close to an animal like that, to understand them the way he did, and then to go to schools free of charge, educate children about the grizzly bear, and advocate for conservation of the grizzly bear. You know, Timothy came off as kind of strange to a lot of people. But I think anyone who spends day after day after day in a tent, and it's just you and your camera, you're going to capture human moments that most of us would prefer to have hidden. And I can empathize with that for him. Number one, he's trying to be entertaining. And number two, he's probably lonely, and he's just spitting out his thoughts on camera. And so all that footage was given over to the documentary maker when the time came. I think it was Werner Herzog. I think there was too much effort made in that documentary to kind of pick apart his points of view, his lowercase t truths that he held for himself as being the protector of the bear. And to me, I'm forgiving of it because I see him being an environmentalist, and he wants to create awareness, and he had to kind of build up a persona to pursue his passion. And so let's just give him some leeway on that and look at the greater good of what he did on educating and providing footage that is mind-boggling and a side to grizzlies that is rarely seen. And he had to break rules to do this. In Alaska, there was a rule: you must be 100 yards away from a grizzly bear. Well, he touched them. So what's your opinion on that? For me, I actually admire it. For those of you who have seen Grizzly Man, there's scenes in there of him with a fox that are just beautiful. It'd be a fox he had known for multiple years, returning summer after summer, and where he set up his tent was right in between two dens. And so I'm guessing he probably shared food with this fox, because he could sit there and just rub the fox's head and scratch behind its ears and pet it, and it provided comfort for him, and he provided comfort for the fox. And having had relationships like this myself with the raccoons, I know what that bond feels like, and I know how special it is. And to see him connect like that tells me he was a good guy. So yeah, as far as my personal situation goes, I really wish my city didn't have this law saying that you cannot feed any animals, wild animals, period. That includes little chipmunks all the way up to raccoons. And if there were bear in the area, of course, you can't feed bear. But for me, it's stealing from the joy that us humans have in this small time we have on Earth. I see myself as part of nature, not separate from nature. There seems to be this movement of pushing us into our corners, that animals belong in these nature preserves and these wilderness areas, and we belong in our cities. And I just think that's backwards. I really think kind of an Avatar type utopia is what I strive for, where animals and humans coexist. And sometimes, yes, we do need to take from nature to survive, but we can give back too in beautiful moments like this where we share our resources. That's an act of altruism. And it builds within us a greater sense of appreciation for our animal cousins, and it provides us joy. It makes us better people. You don't find people who are animal feeders. They're not interested in crime. They're not interested in doing harm to people. It nurtures the best in us. And I think these laws, based on perhaps perfection, is missing the greater point. It's getting in the way of good. So a lot of you have been egging me on. You got to fight back. You got to try and change your city's laws. I'm kind of thinking about all of us in this. I think we all need to put our heads together. Like I did with this video here, let's just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks argument-wise. And perhaps we can come up with something for just a universal law for all human beings, that we all should be able to interact with animals how we see fit. And there should be nothing preventing us from feeding wildlife if we want to. If there needs to be some rules on species that are endangered, I can understand that. But your general animal, like a squirrel, a raccoon, a chipmunk, there should be nothing standing in our way. So yeah, guys, the OONSDAY philosophy is now more than ever, people need to be feeding animals. The attention span of today's youth is like 8 to 15 seconds and they swipe away. We need to have multiple videos like this out there. Cuteness, showing animals in human situations. This is the only thing that's going to get us to care. We've heard all the warnings from scientists about 30,000 species being lost a year to human activities, and this has been going on for decades. I think there's a greater good that overcomes that entire list of cons and having individuals like me and you guys out there feeding animals, getting video of it, and sharing it. Look at the 4 people we talked about today. They all fed animals, and they all made a huge impact on the world by doing so. Let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. Alright guys, thanks for watching this video. Raccoons are running off. Something scary is out there. Happy OONSDAY everyone.